Some empires do not begin to collapse when their rulers become weak. They continue. Taxes are still collected, armies are still fed, governors still issue orders, ceremonies still take place beneath painted ceilings and beneath banners meant to suggest permanence. The emperor appears in public or refuses to appear in public, and the machinery of rule keeps moving anyway. At first glance, this seems impossible. We are taught to think of empire through great individuals, founders, conquerors, reformers, tyrants. We imagine history turning on the character of the man at the top. If he is decisive, the state expands. If he is foolish, the state declines. If he is weak, the system should fail. And yet, again and again, history shows something more unsettling. Weak rulers often inherit systems strong enough to survive them. Sometimes those systems survive for decades, sometimes for centuries. Which raises an important question. If the emperor is no longer truly in control, where does power go? Welcome to the history of the world, where we explain how power rises, how systems endure, and how empires fall. This is not the story of one weak ruler. It is the story of what happens when empires become too large, too organized, and too institutionalized to depend on one person alone. It is the story of how power leaves the individual and settles into procedures, bureaucracies, rituals, military structures, and elites who have learned that continuity serves them better than chaos. A weak emperor is dangerous, but a weak emperor inside a strong system can be survivable. Sometimes he is even useful. He preserves the appearance of rule while others perform its harder functions nearby. This problem tends to appear only after an empire has already succeeded. In the early stages, states are often held together by personal authority. A founder conquers through charisma, fear, military genius, or some combination of all three. Loyalty is personal. Rewards are personal. The system still feels close to the ruler's body, but success creates scale, and scale creates distance. Once an empire grows large enough, one man cannot govern it personally. He cannot inspect every province, hear every legal dispute, collect every tax, negotiate every alliance, or command every army in person. To survive expansion, the state must build organs beyond the ruler himself. It needs scribes, treasuries, provincial officials, courier networks, standing armies, legal norms, succession customs, ceremonial legitimacy, and a political class with something to lose if the whole structure comes apart. That is the paradox. The more successful an empire becomes, the less it can afford to depend entirely on the qualities of one human being. The founder builds by force of will. The successors inherit archives. That sounds less impressive. It is also more durable. Rome offers one of the clearest examples because it is remembered so vividly through its emperors: Julius Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Nero. Their names dominate the imagination, but the durability of Roman power rested less on personality than on the system Augustus created after the civil wars of the 1st century before the Common Era. Augustus understood what late Republican Romans had learned through bloodshed. If power remained too nakedly personal, elites would continue tearing the state apart in competition for it. His solution was brilliant precisely because it concealed as much as it revealed. He concentrated power in himself while preserving the forms of republican legitimacy. The Senate continued to exist. Magistracies continued to exist. Assemblies still had a formal place. But beneath the old language, the real structure had changed. The army was attached to the imperial system. Provincial governance became more regular. Taxation became more organized. The emperor stood at the center of military command, administrative appointment, and political legitimacy. Most importantly, this arrangement could survive a disappointing emperor. Tiberius, Augustus's successor, was intelligent and experienced, but suspicious, withdrawn, and increasingly detached from the public life expected of a Roman ruler. He spent long periods away from Rome. He inspired fear more than affection. Yet the empire continued functioning because governors still governed, taxes were still collected, armies still obeyed their chains of command, and local elites across the provinces still benefited from imperial order. The emperor mattered deeply, but the empire had already become larger than his temperament. Then came Caligula, whose short reign remains one of the most notorious in Roman history. Ancient sources describe extravagance, cruelty, erratic judgment, and theatrical self-display. Some of those accounts were certainly sharpened by hostile writers after his death. Even so, the essential point holds. Caligula was no Augustus. The imperial office, only a generation old, was occupied by someone manifestly unsuited to stable government. Yet Rome did not dissolve. Administration continued because empire by then depended on thousands of routines beyond the emperor's moods. Grain still arrived. Provincial taxes still moved. Commands still passed through military structures. Senators still sought favor because the office itself remained the center of legitimacy. That legitimacy had become institutional. Claudius, who followed, was long underestimated by his own family and by the Roman elite. He was physically frail, politically vulnerable, and not expected to rule. Yet as emperor he proved serious, administrative, and effective in many respects. This is useful because it shows the reverse side of the problem. Once systems exist, an underestimated ruler can sometimes govern more effectively than expected, because the machinery is already there for him to use. Personal weakness and institutional strength do not always produce paralysis. Sometimes they produce a strange form of competence. Nero then reminds us how long institutions can mask deterioration. Self-dramatizing, artistically obsessed, increasingly detached from the burdens of rule, Nero presided over mounting tension between the throne, the Senate, and sections of the military. His decisions worsened distrust, yet even here the system did not instantly collapse. It absorbed, delayed, concealed. Only when military loyalties shifted decisively did the facade fail. And when it failed, in the year that followed, 69, the famous Year of the Four Emperors, the most revealing fact was not that emperors were made and unmade by force. It was that the office survived the chaos. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, Vespasian. Rulers rose and fell in rapid succession, but no one proposed abolishing empire itself. The system had outgrown the individual occupants. What mattered was control of the machinery, not the sanctity of any one man. That is a useful rule for understanding mature states. Once institutions crystallize, crises often concern who controls them rather than whether they exist. A similar pattern appears in Han China, though in a different political language. The Han dynasty, especially after its consolidation, governed through one of the most sophisticated administrative systems of the ancient world. Officials were appointed through layers of recommendation and service. Taxation moved through a defined bureaucracy. The court managed appointments, granaries, military commands, and provincial oversight through elaborate procedures that rested not merely on force but on a growing political culture of imperial order. The emperor was central to this system. He was the apex of the moral and cosmic hierarchy, but as the dynasty matured, the empire became increasingly capable of functioning even when the emperor himself was a child, passive, manipulated, or absent from real decision-making. This happened repeatedly in the later Han period. Several emperors came to the throne as minors. A child cannot govern an empire stretching across immense distances. He cannot command experienced ministers, balance court factions, oversee taxation, or manage military affairs in any meaningful sense. So others did these things for him. Regents, empress dowagers, eunuchs, and scholar officials occupied the space around the throne and exercised power in the emperor's name. The office remained supreme. The occupant was often not. This did not mean the system had failed. In one sense, it meant the opposite. The institutions were strong enough to continue operating while the center was biologically or politically incapable of directing them. Edicts were still issued. Provincial officials still followed procedures. Grain still moved. Court ritual still framed authority. The empire survived not because the emperor ruled effectively, but because everyone around him continued behaving as though the imperial order mattered. But here the story darkens, because weak emperors do not remove power struggles, they relocate them. When the ruler cannot govern, the palace does not become empty, it becomes crowded. In later Han China, eunuchs accumulated influence because they controlled access to the emperor's person. Empress dowagers and their families wielded power through regency. Scholar officials claimed moral authority through their commitment to proper governance. Each group presented itself as the guardian of order. Each also pursued survival and advantage. The institutions that preserved the empire also provided arenas in which factions could struggle behind the curtain of imperial legitimacy. The state remained durable enough to function. It also became opaque enough that real power often lay far from the figure enthroned at its ceremonial center. That is another recurring pattern. Institutional survival can preserve order while simultaneously hiding who actually governs. The Ottoman Empire provides a later, and in some ways even clearer example, because its history is often told through strong sultans in the age of expansion. Mehmed II conquers Constantinople. Selim I expands into the Arab lands. Suleiman the Magnificent presides over imperial grandeur. These rulers fit the familiar image of the energetic emperor directing conquest in person. But once the empire had expanded across southeastern Europe, Anatolia, the Arab provinces, and North Africa, it could no longer depend solely on the personality of the reigning sultan. It required a bureaucracy, fiscal administration, provincial governors, judicial hierarchies, military institutions, palace routines, and a ruling class whose interests were bound to continuity. By the 16th and 17th centuries, some Ottoman sultans were far less commanding than their great predecessors. Several came to the throne young, inexperienced or politically constrained. Some spent much of their lives within the palace, isolated from direct military command and shielded from ordinary political realities. Earlier, sultans had led campaigns in person, later ones often did not. Contemporary observers and later historians sometimes treated this as evidence of immediate decline. But empires are rarely so simple. The Ottoman state continued to function because real governance had become distributed. Grand viziers could direct policy. The imperial council processed decisions. Judges and administrators maintained order in the provinces. Tax farming systems continued producing revenue. Janissaries and provincial notables exercised coercive force when needed. The empire did not depend on the sultan's constant personal vigor to keep operating. Indeed, in some periods, the ruler's weakness strengthened the importance of the office by separating it from daily struggle. The sultan remained the symbolic source of legitimacy, while others took responsibility for the difficult and compromising work of governance. This arrangement was never stable in a perfect sense. It produced factionalism, court intrigue, military interference, and recurring crises over appointments and influence. Palace women, grand viziers, janissary leaders, religious authorities, and provincial elites all shaped outcomes in ways the old image of solitary sovereignty cannot explain. But the empire endured because institutions could carry the burden that individuals could not. There is a double truth here. Institutions preserve empires. Institutions also create new centers of power that may one day rival the throne they were meant to protect. Japan offers a slightly different but highly revealing version of the same pattern. For long periods of Japanese history, especially under the shogunates, the emperor remained the supreme symbol of legitimacy, while actual governing power rested elsewhere. This is not exactly the same as a weak emperor inside an otherwise imperial bureaucracy, but it shows something equally important. Political systems can survive and even stabilize when legitimacy and direct administration separate. The emperor in Kyoto embodied continuity, sacred order, and historical authority. The shogun exercised military and administrative power. The arrangement worked not because it was logically tidy, but because enough elites found it useful. One office sanctified, another governed. The system endured by dividing functions that modern observers often assume must be fused. What ties all these cases together is not culture or geography. It is a structural logic of power. First, legitimacy usually outlives competence. People obey offices, dynasties, rituals, and inherited political forms long after the individual occupying them has ceased to inspire confidence. A throne is not just a chair. It is memory made visible. It carries precedent, fear, habit, and expectation. That is why states often survive rulers who clearly do not deserve the offices they hold. Second, bureaucracies prefer continuity. Officials, judges, tax collectors, military officers, and provincial administrators may dislike a weak ruler, but they usually dislike collapse more. Their status, income, and safety depend on the survival of the system. So they keep it running. They process documents, enforce law, collect revenue, and maintain order, because they are invested in institutional persistence. They do not need to love the emperor. They need the state not to disintegrate. Third, elites fear uncertainty more than mediocrity. A weak emperor may be frustrating, embarrassing, even dangerous. But if his weakness can be managed, many powerful groups will prefer that to the unpredictability of open succession struggles, civil war, or state breakdown. This is why visibly ineffective rulers can remain in place longer than logic seems to allow. They are tolerated because too many people fear the alternative. Fourth, power migrates. It rarely disappears. If the emperor cannot exercise authority effectively, someone nearby will. A mother, a regent, a chamberlain, a minister, a general, a court favorite, a military corps, a council, a bureaucracy, a clique of eunuchs, a provincial coalition. History provides endless candidates. Power hates a vacuum. If the center weakens, the system improvises. But there is a cost to all this. A system that survives weak emperors can also drift into decay without immediately appearing to fail. Ritual continues. Titles remain grand. Ceremonies preserve the image of order. Archives thicken. Taxes still arrive, though perhaps less reliably. Armies still exist, though perhaps more loyal to commanders than to the state. The throne remains occupied. From a distance, stability appears intact. This is why institutional resilience can be deceptive. When people think of decline, they often imagine visible collapse. Palaces burning, invaders pouring through gates, dynasties ending in obvious catastrophe. More often, decline begins as redistribution. Power moves away from where official language says it lives. The emperor still reigns, but ministers rule. Ministers still issue orders, but military elites decide which ones matter. Taxes are still collected, but more of them remain in private hands. Legitimacy is still invoked, but fewer believe in it deeply. The system survives weakness by adapting to it, and in doing so, it sometimes normalizes the very conditions that will later hollow it out. Rome survived weak emperors, but the price was repeated military intervention in succession. Han China survived child emperors, but the price was corrosive factional struggle within the court. The Ottoman Empire survived less active sultans, but the price was growing power for palace factions, janissaries, and provincial intermediaries. In each case, institutional survival was real. So was the gradual displacement of authority away from its official center. That is the unsettling lesson. Most people assume power lives in extraordinary individuals. History suggests something more complicated. In mature empires, power often survives weak rulers because it has already migrated into systems, into offices, rituals, bureaucracies, tax structures, chains of command, and the interests of elites who depend on continuity. This makes great states more durable than heroic storytelling allows. It also makes them harder to read. A weak emperor does not necessarily mean immediate collapse. Sometimes he means the opposite. He means the state is now strong enough to function without him. For a while. And that final phrase matters, because the same institutions that protect an empire from weak rulers can also hide how weak the empire itself is becoming. The throne remains. The ceremonies continue. Orders are issued in the old language. The state appears intact because its forms are intact, until one day it becomes clear that the emperor was not the only thing that had grown weak. The past is quiet, but it's never done speaking. Subscribe to the History of the World, because understanding how it worked is the first step to understanding where we are now.